Hi, and welcome to MeriTalk's State Tech Vision program for 2023. We're coming to you from the NASCIO, National Association of State Chief Information Officers Conference, mid-year conference, in beautiful National Harbor, just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm John Thomas Flynn. I'm the Senior Advisor. I'm Program Person for Government at MeriTalk, and formerly president of NASCIO, as a matter of fact, and was first CIO both in California and Massachusetts. We've got a great panel of CIOs and CISOs today, and industry experts for today's discussion. Representing my native Massachusetts, I'm pleased to be joined by Chief Information Security Officer Tony O'Neill. From Maryland, I'm happy to welcome Chief Secretary of Information Technology, and also Katie Savage is a member of the cabinet, right? Okay. Also happy to have Brian Milkison, Vice President and General Manager of the U.S. Public Sector at Datadog, and James Nika, Senior Technology Lead of the Public Sector at HashiCorp. And thanks to the folks in the audience for tuning in. It's great to have everyone here today, so let's get started. Remember, these questions are open to everyone, although we might call on somebody unexpectedly to answer one of these questions. There's no grade being given, so just do your best and we'll pass it along to somebody that's interested. Why don't we first start by going around the room and tell us a little bit about yourself for a minute or so, and your expertise and experience, particularly in the public sector and state and local government. Tony, I'll start with you.
Great, thank you, John, and thanks to MeriTalk for having me here today. My background is I'm a lawyer by trade, and so that education and training has kind of helped me in state government, where I've been with Massachusetts for the past 5 years, focused on developing the enterprise risk management program, which cybersecurity, cyber risk being one of the leading business risks. So I've focused in developing and building a governance structure across the executive branch so that we can mature those defenses.
Mm-hmm. Thank you again, John, for the introduction and the invitation to this event. James Nika, I'm a solution engineer today, supporting a lot of technical sales and leadership opportunities at HashiCorp. My background is really a software engineer. So I've built large and small systems on the financial side, in the Middle East, in Central Europe, in Tokyo, Japan, but most of them in the US for over 20 years. I've worked and supported the Department of Defense, some of the IC, in trying to get some of this zero trust story moving along over the past decade or so. So I'm really happy to be here and discuss this.
Okay, Brian?
Brian Mickelson, 25 years in IT and IT sales leadership. The last 20 or so are in public sector. I've had the opportunity of working for IBM, Cisco Systems, Red Hat for 20 years, and for the last year, been opening up Datadog's U.S. public sector practice, both across federal and state and local entities.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Katie?
Hi, I'm Katie Savage. I became the Secretary of IT for the state of Maryland back in January, and then promptly went on maternity leave. So I'm a little bit new in the role, but I have an extensive experience in government. Most of my career has been across all three levels. So prior to this role, I was at the Pentagon for 4 years, running the Defense Digital Service, which is a team within the Secretary's office charged with using technology to solve emerging crises. And before that, I created a public-private partnership with the City of Chicago and a number of large corporations to design technology for the City of Chicago, which could be exported around the world.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, welcome all. Okay, first, start with Anthony. You've won plaudits in Massachusetts and around the country for your enterprise approach to cybersecurity and zero trust, and you focus on emphasizing cultural changes that are necessary. Not an easy thing to do, as we're all aware. How does this work, and more importantly, how did you get the buy-in from your team to affect this cultural change?
So, great question, John. And it's been a journey, and we're still learning every day. But the cultural aspect, and I kind of harken back to Peter Drucker, and he used to say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we had to really build an approach that was going to engage the workforce and want them to become more of a risk-aware culture. So we first started by creating a methodology, which I call it the survey, workshop, survey, town hall, debrief. And so we went around our entire agency and we pushed out survey questions to everybody and asked them to rate different risks, depending on what kind of work they did, whether they're in the finance office, whether they're in the legal department, are they in operations, security, technology. So we went across the board looking at all of our staff. And I think that engagement, they felt a belonging to the process. And we continued to engage with them in face-to-face workshops, which were done largely remotely during the pandemic. But it was a very effective tool because we could actually meet with everybody on a more frequent basis because everybody was at home and they were glued to their computer screens. So it was a nice opportunity to lay the foundation. And laying the foundation was critical to the work that we're doing now. And what we've converted that into is across not just our agency, which is a secretariat now. We have across Massachusetts state government. The executive branch has about now 10 secretariats. Our secretariat being technology and security services, which reports directly to the governor and her administration. We ended up wanting to have a governance model that would have a CIO and a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Information Officer at each secretariat level. So we built a CIO council and a CISO council, and the two groups meet on a monthly basis, and that's helping us drive and engage these issues across the entire executive branch. And we've had wonderful feedback. It's still a work in progress, and we're learning every day from each other as the threat surface continues to expand. And we're very excited about the prospects of the future. That's how we created the culture.
Well, I want to follow up later and ask you about that the whole process of if you're going to put that organization together. There's a lot of hiring and training involved, and it must have been a real challenge to get that many people in those particular skills. Brian, I know you were interested in this particular question. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, a lot, but I'll try to keep them brief. When we think about this from the Datadog perspective, we don't have a specific zero trust solution. We are complementary in the way that what we do is we are a full stack hybrid architecture observability solution. So I think one of the biggest things Anthony talked about was, he quoted Peter Drucker and culture. What I would attach to here is I think that's probably the number one challenge that I see to innovative technology adoption at the state level. It's just simply we are still battling, I think, some traditional IT culture, siloed culture. And where Datadog comes at this, we have a distinct point of view. We think that our tool actually combines to allow that success of people, process, and tools by breaking down the silos that are inhibiting the culture of sharing and the culture of understanding risk. And so for us, whether we're talking at the network layer, infrastructure layer, apps, or security through log management, what we're really doing is we're bringing all those people, whether operators, developers, or security professionals, or senior analysts and executive staff, into the same conversation, so that they're seeing the same issues from the same point of view, and they're dealing with the issues from that point of view.
Well, it's certainly it has to be said that the idea of change management in government, it's a huge challenge. I remember when I first went to California, one of the senior people came up to me and said, "Hey, Flynn, you're a heroine." And I said, "What's a heroine?" He said, "I'm here when you got here, and I'll be here when you leave." And it was true. Anyway, it's very much a challenge, and it permeates almost all these issues we're talking about. I want to talk about mandates. Federal agencies are trying to move to zero trust architectures, motivated in part by mandates, executive orders, Office of Management and Budget, setting specific zero trust benchmarks. But state and local governments are not required to do that. And a general question we asked around the table before we got started is nobody thinks they're about to do that. I don't know, some rogue out there will, but it's very, very difficult. In the absence of these mandates, And it's always, remember, when you get mandates, it's nice to have a mandate. A mandate is a law that's going to help you get things done. Used to say if you get a law or get the governor or the president to put it in a speech, you can make it happen. But in absence of mandates, how are state and local government leaders going to impress upon their teams to fund, impress upon their legislature and their executive to fund this vital mission of retiring legacy IT systems and securing their networks from security threats? How's that going to work?
So I can possibly present a perspective here. I think the mandate simply is a recognition of the fact that that reality has changed. So it's simply a way for everybody to publicly acknowledge that this is the situation and therefore we need to take action. But I think states also do recognize that the challenges that are ahead of them are a forcing function as a result of all the changes that are happening in technology and in the scope and in their environments. So regardless of there being a mandate or not, I think they're going to be forced to change, to adapt and deal with the changes that are required given the change that has happened to the climate. Mm-hmm. So we at HashiCorp, for example, given that we try to be enablers of our customers who are trying to move and with the times to the cloud, to these environments, and realizing that the network boundary has dissolved around them, right? So that zero trust story is what is supposed to replace that. So I think regardless of a mandate, you find, and to hearken Peter Drucker again, he also said, if you don't have a customer, you don't have a business. So, our customers are demanding that we adapt and give them the tools and the capabilities necessary to make that change, including those states that have recognized we're in a new environment, we're operating differently. How do we take advantage of these things?
It's interesting. So it's, in a sense, their supporting vendor community is forcing you in many respects to go this way.
Very much so.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I would just simply offer that, picking up where you left off on, the boundary has eroded. I think we just have to get to a kind of a 101 understanding of what zero trust is as well, which is it's a significant shift from where we were historically, that we had a perimeter, it was firewalled, we could have less security behind the firewall, and I think we used to use a concept of least privileged access. In the zero trust environment, it's a no privileged access, right? So we'll get to it a little bit later, but from an information assurance perspective, from a AAA perspective, it's the idea that we have to manage identity, and then that identity is granted the specific privileges, not where that identity is in terms of the firewall. Mm-hmm.
I'll just also add, I think what I've seen so far is identity and rather cybersecurity is somewhat divorced from our operations, which I think is the largest challenge. It's difficult to implement a zero trust infrastructure or framework if we don't have a good understanding of our asset inventory, for example, or our Active Directory. So one of I love what you were saying about a mandate being a recognition of where we are, and I think that's the right way to think about it. But I think one of the resources we also have to offer to our agencies is the ability to manage from a hardware and network perspective, account management perspective, so that it's not just you will implement this architecture, but rather let's understand the attack surface to begin with.
Very good. Next question. We're going to talk a little bit about identity and access management, which is such a key to the whole issue of zero trust. Managing identities, access, privileges, credentials, allowing organizations to enforce security policies consistently. This is all very important. You can't achieve zero trust without IAM. So, Tony or Katie, how are your states approaching the integration of IAM into their enhanced security postures? What advice can you offer going forward?
So I think John Adams said facts are stubborn things, right? And so understanding the asset management component that Katie described, I think is one of the greatest barriers to this whole identity access management problem we're all trying to solve. In Massachusetts, what we did was 5 years ago, consolidated the IT function. So our secretariat manages the network and the agencies manage their business applications. So we think that's a good model. We've had success in implementing that model over the past few years. But one of the things that we're doing in ushering in more of the zero trust and identity access management principles is by creating what we call the Application Security Center of Excellence. So we're doing rigorous code scanning and testing on any kind of third-party cloud service provider that's going to be doing business with us. And this is for, to the extent that these are not homegrown legacy applications. Some of our agencies are still doing that on a relatively frequent basis, but there is a movement to rely more heavily on third-party cloud service providers, and we want to be able to solve the zero trust problem simultaneously while we're testing the security of the third parties.
Mm-hmm. Kay, do you have anything to add on that point?
I would agree. What we've seen, from my time at DoD and now the state of Maryland, it's exactly that. We can sort of leverage a third party to do that verification, and then that's something too that we saw, I think, in a positive direction during the pandemic when we were in an entirely remote environment. We were sort of forced to adopt that methodology for how we provide that type of security. But I'll again say, identity management, while part of the security team, absolutely also needs to find its way into the operations framework. So what we're trying to do is to think about how we bridge that gap between the CISO and our operational team.
Some of the folks I've talked to around the country from state and local government say that this is a very challenging situation to go the IAM route. Do you guys agree with that? I mean, has anybody finished one yet?
So there are a couple phenomena, I think, that are taking place. If you look technically, identity for machines was typically the IP address, right? So the unique mechanism by which a machine could be identified on a network. Culturally and socially, the identity used to be the name, and then it transformed to being the username. So that's how people sort of saw themselves, is with respect to their username on a particular closed network that they used to connect to. But the shift that's occurred now is you have a proliferation of identities. We have a leakage of identities from our personal lives coming into our professional and working lives. So you have an identity on Google. You have another identity on your social media. You have a private identity based on the different hobbies and things that you do. So all these identities have to somehow be coherently managed and dealt with because they're not going away. And for the states and the different agencies, it's a challenge to figure out what identities do we allow in and do we broker and use as part of the system, as part of meeting that demand signal from your customers and your stakeholders, and which ones do we reject, either for technical reasons of not being robust enough or perhaps not being as efficient at what they do. So it's truly a complicated challenge. As Katie mentioned there, Active Directory being one of those mechanisms by which you can manage identity is probably the most commonly implemented and adopted identity mechanism. But there are others. There is Ping, there's Duo, there's the famous Okta that are all out there. And all of these have a part to play. So I would submit that the challenge is probably how do we reasonably assess all these different mechanisms, services, and offerings for managing identity, coherently have a plan through partnering with private organizations and with partnerships to actually manage them in service of the citizen, right?
I would also add it's a framework for where we're managing, which layer we're managing at the state CIO level. Some states have an entirely centralized model. My state is somewhere in the middle, where we manage centrally assets. We manage Network Maryland, shared network, and our radio infrastructure. But at the application layer, we don't. The larger agencies manage their own applications. So to your point, there's not a solid framework from a security perspective about whose responsibility is that when you have sort of some things are centralized and some layers are not.
Yeah.
We actually
Complicated.
I'll add on to that. We actually see from the variety of answers that came out, that's what we see from the Datadog side as well. So we think of information assurance management in a slightly different way. Internally, we have policies in terms of who of our customers can access which data in terms of what we analyze. But in the bigger picture, what we see is a market full of information assurance vendors. And so whether we're talking about Azure, whether we're talking, having you here from Hashi, whether we're talking about Vault or Console or Nomad, what Datadog does in this business to help the government is we manage out-of-the-box integrations. So pretty much every identity, information assurance management technology that we've named at the table so far, Datadog has an out-of-the-box integration for, which I think is a big part of the puzzle, because it's how do you integrate not just the identity management technology, but how do I observe that? How do I know what's happening with that? Whether I'm talking about access at the individual level, access to the service level, access to database and data management. So it's a pretty complex puzzle. You asked if it's ever finished. I don't know that it's ever anything that does get finished. I think it's something that continually evolves and just has to make progress.
Yeah,
over
certainly.
time.
Just look at particularly a place like California that has, 100 people retire, every month. And, there's another 100 people hired and doing all that with different, thousands of different systems. Jeez, it's quite the challenge.
John, you touched
And
on a
like
great
you said,
point.
as soon as you get it done, it's like painting
Yeah.
the bridge. You got to go back and start over again.
That's right, and I look at this as operational risks, because when you have onboarding and offboarding at that level of frequency that you just described, you're bound to have some errors along the way. Humans, we're human, we make errors. And so I think the challenge is creating some type of a system that can withstand the test of time, and that's still a problem we're trying to solve.
Right. Enough IAM. Give us a headache just thinking about it. Let's look at the partnership between public sector and private sector. States and locals best work with private sector in implementing zero trust security. How is that going to work? How will these partnerships benefit citizens who demand so much online government service lately? It's becoming a backlog of trying to get things done on such a grand basis, if you will. Anyone? I guess the best way to ask this is, if you're a private industry company, how do you work with the state? What do you say to them? Hey, let me help you out with this. What's the best way to do that the state doesn't think this is one more sales call?
So I know one of the approaches we take, I've experienced this a lot with my DoD customers, some of my state and local customers as well. I see myself and we see ourselves, I think, as a private company, as helping shield the government from some of the effects of the fast pace of change, right? So
save them from themselves, right?
Well, I think they're very, very capable. What I find is they're very strong leaders. They're people who are particularly good at managing projects, at managing initiatives, and they truly can understand the needs of the citizenry in a way that I, in a private company, will not have. I have a private, motive that is a capitalist motive.
Yeah.
But what I try to do is shield them to some extent from that pace of change by providing, in as efficient a way as I can, training, upskilling, just basic communication and enablement on the kinds of things that we're seeing, some kind of risk profiling. What does it mean when you have intelligent chatbots that are going to show up on your network? They're coming. That's not going to, it's not going to go away. But what are some of the responses you can take? How do you think about and frame the problem? Right? Is some of what we try to do.
Ryan, what's your approach?
Yeah, and I'm going to tie this two questions together if you don't mind. Earlier we talked about how do we deal with unfunded mandates. So whether it's mandated or not, zero trust is the security model in the cloud world, and we live in a cloud world. And so I think the first thing that vendors like Datadog can do given what we do in this world of full stack observability, is we help our customers quantify the problem. I think as you think about how do I get a state to understand that it needs to fund zero trust initiatives, or at least some improved cyber initiative funding over time, the first thing I've got to do is I've got to quantify that problem. How many vulnerabilities do I have at any particular time? What's the risk of those vulnerabilities? And that's where I think that now I'll kind of connect it back to the public-private partnerships that work out so well. That is where companies like Hashi and companies like Datadog, I think, come into the fray. Very innovative public companies having a tremendous amount of success on the private sector side. And it's our role as public sector leaders in these organizations to help adapt that which we're doing in the private sector and make it consumable by our government customers. And I think that comes in form of training. It comes in the form, for us, it comes in the form of we do proof of concepts with almost every interaction that we have. We are out there doing first we start off with a demonstration of the capability. We try to understand specifically, back to that quantifiable metric, what's the unique pain that government is trying to address. And then we'd like to come out and actually do a full-blown proof of concept where we implement our technology to show them exactly how it works in their environment.
I used to love proof of concept, particularly free.
Yeah,
proof of concepts.
and that's sort of how it works these days. I mean, like there's enough competition, and I think we've been quoting Drucker a lot. I'll go to a different one, which is Jeffrey Moore, and he says a market without competition is not a market. What I can tell you is the world of zero trust and observability is definitely a market.
I bet. Katie, any recommendations or suggestions you can make to our vendor community on these issues?
Well, I think to the point of what the competition can offer, a model that I've seen is where we make especially local, hyper-local municipalities less afraid to pick up the phone and call either the vendor or the state CISO, for example. I think there's often this fear, of I clicked on this email and I might have created a vulnerability, for example. And if one of the things I think vendors can do is create a model where take insurance, for example, cybersecurity insurance. If we have a world where municipalities are so afraid to pick up the phone and report something because they're afraid of how their premiums will change, we sort of have that. We could have a proliferation. So if we make it so there's a partnership with the vendor community such that you can make a phone call and ask what to do, ask for more guidance, sort of describe the situation, almost like a virtual CISO program. We can sort of take the fear and sort of de-risk the situation.
Sure.
I think what I would also add to this is the problems at the local government level are not like the same, right? Some have a much more mature approach to this the larger the city or the town. Some have a very low level of maturity on not just cybersecurity, but IT in general. So I think that to the extent that a process or a method can be developed to help those that are probably in the greatest need, that would be a good thing that we can apply.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to the cloud a little bit. State and local governments, as they attempt to move their systems to the cloud, are recognizing they've encountered some security challenges with this, and they require rethinking on how to secure their applications and infrastructure. What are the obstacles that states and localities face in the move to the cloud and zero trust security? How should they overcome them?
I would say, and maybe it's less of an obstacle, but one thing that I always caution is just is a lift and shift without looking at the application itself for usability and customer experience. What we've seen in shifting some of our applications is many of them just need to be deprecated. They're not something that can't be, they were sort of homegrown versus a SaaS product. So why are we spending all this time and energy doing that? Particularly, I think we've evolved a lot as a community around UX, UI, and it's an opportunity to step back. What does the customer need? Is this still a need that the state has, that residents have it? Have they ever had that need? And is this something that can be accomplished with a SaaS product? For me, I think you can immediately sort of shave off a lot of the time and energy and cost when you look at the application itself for sort of usability and necessity.
Okay. Ryan, you're agreeing with that?
Yeah, I had a few, just kind of in terms of the challenges, right? I think there's some lack of expertise. I think the larger federal entities and then when you make your way into the private sector, I think there's an expertise scale, and I think a lack of expertise is part of the challenge. I think complexity is part of the challenge. It is easier for a cloud native company that was born in the cloud, that started off as a holistic enterprise. It is easier for them to get things done than it is for an entity that has been around for 100 years, that has started off with data centers as closet space, with this protected monolithic server sitting over here, which gets you then into the legacy systems and applications. So the real question is, I think it comes back to culture, but it's how do we take a more specific point of view that we are living in a cloud native world. We're talking about SaaS delivered services. That is going to be the future. And there's a decent book out there, and I think at this point it's a decade old, but it's called Consumption Economics. And one of the things it talks about, and here we are 10 years later, but I think there's still very timely discussions. SaaS is exploding for a reason. SaaS takes a lot of things off the government's plate. So software as a service capabilities, it puts the risk on the vendor side. Because instead of you having to take the burden of hopefully one day achieving what was in the slides, the vendor has to develop a full-blown solution that you actually purchase back in a microtransaction way. Complexity, we're delivering a simple service, and the burden of the IT complexity in the SaaS world lives back on the vendor side. It just sort of keeps on going, but whether it's cost, complexity, technology burden, even though it seems like we're moving at this breakneck pace, this particular book was written a decade ago, and it was written about things that were happening 5 years before that. I think we're just at this place in time, driven a little bit by COVID and a little bit about what we have to do from a security architecture perspective. But we've got to get from where we're at in legacy systems and avoidance of the pain, and really think about how quickly can we innovate and bring in a more modern approach.
Okay.